Hello and welcome to the introduction to the Ionic Framework webcast. My name is Raleigh Johnson and I'm a senior developer at Component 1, a division of Grape City. I primarily work with the HTML5 and JavaScript products and primarily Wijmo 5. If you haven't checked out Wijmo 5, I strongly suggest that you do. Wijmo 5 is a focused set of JavaScript controls made for modern browsers. So these aren't really widgets, these are more traditional full-fledged controls. We really won't be looking at Wijmo beyond this, but there is a sample that we'll be using later on, so I figured I should mention it now. All right, so let's get started. So today I'd like to discuss Ionic and what it has to offer. This is going to be very much a beginner's course, so we're not going to be looking at a lot of code or anything in depth. Really, I just want to make sure that you understand the fundamentals and what Ionic has to offer. So today we're going to be looking at native versus hybrid. This isn't really going to be a full-fledged comparison of what native and hybrid have to offer, but really more just as a history lesson to kind of lead us into Ionic. Then we're going to look at what Ionic actually is, and then take a look at the Ionic CLI, some demos, and some related projects. And then at the end we're going to finally close things up with some Q&A. But if you have any questions along the way, please feel free, and we'll answer those as we go. So everybody today wants a mobile application. So that's great, but there's a lot of downsides to going fully native. So you're going to need developers to have knowledge of each platform specifically, whether that's iOS, Android, or one of the many others popping up now and again. You'll have a lot of separate code bases, which is expensive, both in terms of resources and just kind of maintenance costs. So there's a lot of benefits to actually going fully native too, but that's not really in the context of this discussion. But there are some alternatives. So there's things like Xamarin, but today we're going to be talking about Apache Cordova and how it lets us create hybrid applications. So hybrid apps are basically self-contained websites running in a browser shell called a web view. So this really isn't a browser. These are actually installed on the device. And so you can really think of this as web wrapped in the native layer. So with Cordova, you get access to consistent native APIs through JavaScript, and you can also have one code base, all in JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, but still target many platforms with that same code base. And this is really especially appealing to web developers because you can use a lot of the libraries, such as jQuery, that you use today, a lot of the same tooling like WebStorm or Sublime Text, and you can reuse all your existing knowledge. So, if you know how to do AJAX requests, for instance, on the web, you can do that in Cordova. So there's still something missing whenever you're looking at Cordova, and it really doesn't give you a lot of what native SDKs give you. So native SDK gives you a lot of full-featured UI components for particular devices, navigations, transitions, animations, interactions, and much, much more. But that really doesn't exist for Cordova or the web in general. And that's kind of where Ionic fits in and it attempts to bridge that gap. So Ionic is an HTML5, JavaScript, and CSS3 framework. It's made by a company called Drifty, and it's actually modeled heavily after native SDKs. This isn't for the mobile web. If you need something like that, use something like responsive web design. Instead, this is specifically for Cordova applications. So Ionic is free and open source. It's kind of new to the web world, being only about a year and a half old. And it's actually in its final release candidate stage, and I would expect to see a version 1.0 soon in 2015. And we mentioned earlier that Cordova supports many platforms. So for example, we have Windows Phone 8, Windows RT, iOS, Android, and a few others. Ionic, on the other hand, only supports iOS 7 and above, and Android 4.1 and above. So Windows will be coming probably shortly after version 1. But if you're a little bit alarmed by the iOS and Android support, here are the numbers from the developer stores. So we can actually see iOS 8 and iOS 7 combined is about 97% market share, with 3% being about iOS 6. And for Android, anything 4.1 and up, so we really have froyo, gingerbread, and ice cream sandwich. That's only about 15% of the market. So if you use Ionic today, you're going to be able to get a lot of the mainstream applications out there for any device. And then whenever Windows Phone comes to the market, I think everything will be pretty solid. So to continue on, I actually like to kind of split this up into two different parts. The first being the UI side, and the second part being the app framework side of things. So first, let's start with the UI side. So you can kind of consider Ionic to be Bootstrap for native. It's not a true one-to-one comparison, but it's always nice to compare to something that you're already familiar with. So Ionic is responsive, like Bootstrap, but it completely ignores the desktop side of things. And so we mentioned earlier, too, that Cordova runs in what's called a web view. So just like today on the web, the web view on iOS is going to be slightly different from the web view on Android. So Ionic actually fills that gap and kind of smooths out all the quirks and differences between each device and just lets you develop your applications. In addition to this, you get UI components through simple and well-documented CSS and HTML, just like Bootstrap. You also get a lot of transitions. So for instance, when a mobile modal pop-up is displaying, you'll get that nice kind of rich native feel whenever it's shown and hidden. And you also get a lot of icons, specifically for mobile applications, and these are kind of like Bootstrap's glyph icons. And what's even more is that Ionic is meant to be customized. So if you look at some of the demos online, you'll notice that things aren't pixel perfect, and that's intentional. So if you've ever worked with something like jQuery UI or something that's very, very heavily customized, you know how much it can be a pain. So Ionic realized this, and they made their CSS very minimalistic. So you can actually customize this two ways, just by overriding the CSS directly, or actually using their Sass preprocessor to customize all of the CSS as well. But when we looked at the native SDKs earlier, this really doesn't give everything that a native SDK gives us. So we're still missing a piece, things like navigation, views, and gestures. And that's where the AngularJS comes in. If you're not familiar with AngularJS, it's actually a single-page application framework made by Google. And coincidentally, using single-page applications is the best practice for Apache Cordova applications. And that's really for performance reasons. Angular is also proven for large-scale web development and gives you a whole lot of great things like separations of concerns, loose coupling, data binding, routing, and a whole lot more. So Ionic takes advantage of this and actually exposes its UI components as directives, which basically let you extend the HTML language. So instead of writing a div, applying a CSS class to it, instead you would just, for instance, write Ion mobile or modal, and that would give you maybe a pop-up. So you also get your navigation history and navigation itself, transitions and animations, interactions and gestures, actually performance enhancements just above and beyond what you get out of the box. So things like tap delays are no longer an issue. You get view caching and prefetching, and UI virtualization, so you're only rendering what's being shown on the screen. So before we actually get into the demos, I'd like to just show you a few of these UI components so we can kind of look at what they look like and the markup kind of side by side and kind of explain what each one does. So the first one we're going to take a look at is lists. So a list is pretty straightforward. This is going to be like an unordered list that you'd use in just normal HTML. And you have some classes here, so really this is the CSS version. You could also use the directive. So instead of div class list, you would say ion list. And this would be ion item for each list item. So pretty simple. And you'll be using this quite a bit. The next is tabs. Tabs are also a common navigation in mobile applications. Tabs in Ionic, they actually give you nested views. So if we look at each tab here in the markup, you can see what's called an Ion nav view, and that's kind of basically a nested view within each of these tabs. You also get a separate stack history. So if I were to go to more facts, switch back to contacts, and then switch back to facts, we would we'd maintain the same page that we're actually on. And a lot of this is brought to you by the Angular UI router. We also have side menus, and this is another common form of navigation typically found on Android. And if we look closely here on the right, you can actually see our main content screen. But this is the left side menu. And the way it's designed is using an Angular directive. And this is Ion side menus. You have your content. And this area right here would actually be the main content area where this right-hand panel is. Ion side menu here is actually the side menu itself. And then you put your header, and then all of your content goes within this block here. You also have navigation. So what this does is it basically gives you automatic back buttons and so on. So this is all brought to you by the Angular UI router and Ionic working together. And you also get some really nice transitions with this as well. So if I were to click the back button here, we'd see a nice sliding transition to take us back to our former screen. So without further ado, let's actually get into some examples here. And we're going to start off by looking at the Ionic CLI. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at today is going to be the Ionic CLI. This is going to be very similar to the Cordova CLI that you may have already worked with, but Ionic's going to take that a step further and add some actual features to it, either just wrap what Cordova already provides, or it provides something completely new. So to actually get this, you're going to run a node package manager command, and it would be install -g Ionic. I already have this installed, so I'm not going to do this today, but let's take a look at what Ionic has to offer. So these are all the commands that you have available to you provided by Ionic. So some of these are going to be very simple, some of them are already provided by Cordova, and some of them are completely new. So an example of something simple is info or help. Info is just going to give you some platform information about where you're developing on, things about the Ionic CLI. Help is going to give you additional information about all the commands and flags that you can run with the CLI. And some of these other ones, for instance, emulate, build, and run, those are provided by Cordova right out of the box. Other things, on the other hand, like templates, ions, lists, and a few others, those are actually provided by Ionic themselves. So if we were to actually run Ionic help right now, we can see a whole bunch of flags that are available to us and really show us some of the full potential of what Ionic can do. So the first thing we're actually going to do in terms of demos is we're actually just going to create an application from scratch. And then we're going to use this using Ionic's generator feature. So basically what the generator does is it pulls a project template from the internet and creates a new Cordova project for you with everything that you're going to need, from the Cordova specific stuff to the Ionic libraries and actually some HTML templates, controllers, and services. So if we actually want to see what templates are available, we can just run Ionic templates. Let's try that again. There we go. So we can see that we have a tabs template, side menu, blank, Salesforce, tests, and complex list. For most new applications, you're probably going to choose the blank starter project because this just gives you a bare shell of an Ionic app. In this case, I really want to take a look at some of the tabs navigation and give you a better idea of what it has to offer. So I'm going to just run Ionic, start, the name of my application, and we'll call this tab app, and put in the tabs template. We're also going to switch to the directory tab app and add a platform. So there we've actually just downloaded the project. It's actually initializing everything for us right now. It's then going to switch us into the directory and then add the Android platform. And the Android platform itself is just everything you're going to need to actually work with an actual Android device. And this is all provided to you by Cordova. So if we actually open up the tab app, we can see that we have a fully baked Cordova application, and this www folder is actually going to be our application files. So this is going to be where we're going to put all of our JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And we can see that we have some templates here, the Ionic libraries, and so on. So if we actually want to run this application, we can just simply issue the Ionic serve command. And this is going to open up a new browser window for us. And we can actually see this running. So we can switch between different tabs. We can select one of these guys here. Let's switch back to friends. And I mentioned earlier that you have a single stack trace. So if you switch back between friends and chats, we can see that our navigation history is maintained for each tab, which is kind of nice. But this is kind of a kludgy way of testing things. It doesn't really look like what our devices are going to look like. This might be like a gigantic sized tablet, if you will. So let's shut down this and show you a different kind of feature so we can see this in a more realistic way. Now, of course, we could just run this in an emulator or on an actual device. But really, when you're developing, sometimes it's nice just to run things in the browser. And you actually need it to look like your actual device. So we're going to actually add a different command called lab, which is an experimental feature that Ionic just released. And what this is going to do is do the exact same thing, and then it's going to open up a new browser window and show us our app. But instead, we get to see iOS and Android side by side, much more similar to what they're actually going to look like on your actual device. And you can also see some slight differences between Android and iOS. And that's because Ionic tries to emulate the look and feel of the native device as much as possible. So if you're familiar with Android, you're going to see the tabs on the top usually. Rather than on iOS, you're going to see the tabs on the bottom. So it's kind of cool. And you can actually switch, run this just like any other browser app. So you're not going to have any limitations really. And another cool thing that we can do here is actually look at the live reload feature. So if I go into, say, tabs here, and I'm going to edit it, and let's just make this a little bit bigger so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to change the status tab in the lower left-hand corner to status test, and just save my document. And we can see that automatically the browser reloaded and pushed my changes. And this is really nice because you can instantly see the changes that you're making reflected in the browser. And what's even nicer is that you can see this on an emulator and a connected device as long as they support WebSockets, which most devices today do. And you can actually configure this as well to work with your CSS. And you can also configure it if you have different folders or files that you don't really want to watch. So if you have something that might be expensive to refresh every time, you can certainly configure it to ignore those files and folders. So the next thing I want to show you is the Ionic's ability to help you make icons and splash screens. And these are things that every developer is going to need, and every app's going to need, rather. So I'm just going to grab two files that I have here, made by one of my designers here at Component 1. The first one is an icon and a splash screen. And let's just take a look at both of these. So the minimum dimensions here for an icon are going to be 196 by 196. It should be squared and have no rounded corners. And the same for the splash screen. Its dimensions should be 2208 by 2208, completely square, and it should be have no rounded corners. So how does this help you? So what this will do is it'll actually let you. So what this will do is actually let you put these into your project folder and the Ionic CLI will basically resize those for all the different devices that you're going to be working with. So it's actually not going to create your images, but it'll actually send these to your servers, crop and resize them for you, and then send them back. And let's take a look at this now. So I need to first create a new folder and call it resources, and copy those files in there. And we're going to just go into the command line and run Ionic resources command. And if we actually wanted to, we could specify just to do the splash screen or the icon. Either one's okay. But for today, we're going to do both. I run the command, and we're going to see a lot of green here on my screen. And what that's actually doing, for each platform that I have configured in my app, we're actually going to get a whole bunch of different sizes. So we can see that for 36 by 36, 96 by 96, and a whole bunch of different dimensions are automatically generated for us. This is really convenient. What's more is that we have this config XML. This is a Cordova feature, and we're actually going to edit this, make it full screen, and we can see that all of these icons and splash screens are linked within this config XML. And this will tell Cordova to actually pull these onto the device whenever we're deploying and use these as the splash screen and the icons. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to start up my emulator. This isn't your standard Android emulator. It's called Genymotion, and it's basically a virtual machine that acts as an emulator. So while that's starting up, I'm just going to clear my screen to give us a little more real estate. And I'm going to run this sample. To do that, instead of running the run command, the emulate command, we're actually going to use the run command. And this is because Genymotion is actually recognized as an actual device. And we're going to run that now, and I think it should be okay. What this is going to do is do the build and all the configuration stuff, pack up our app into the native Android format, and it will actually deploy it on our emulator. And this can take a few minutes. But I also have an example already on my emulator, and this is a backup app that I had configured earlier. And you can see the icons here that are different than the normal Cordova app. And we can see my splash screen finally appearing. All right. So now we're going to get started and actually take a look at the expense tracker application. The expense tracker was actually created for Wijmo to kind of show the integration between Ionic and Wijmo themselves. So I'm going to navigate to my desktop, and we're just going to run this in the browser. So in this sample, we're going to see some of the UI components that we looked at, just the static images. So the first one here is going to be the side menu. So we can see that this is going to act just like it does on a native device. And we can also see some really nice icons, and these are all provided by Ionicons, the native icon library provided by Ionic. We can also look at some of the form support. Some of these are actually Wijmo controls, but we still have nice buttons, UI support here for all of our forms. We can also take a look at some complex lists. So an example of a complex list allows for things like reordering. So I can actually order these differently. And if we go back to the overview screen, we can see the order changed in my chart as well. We can also look at a different feature, which is the swipe feature. This is kind of covering our gestures. And we can also swipe to delete. So I'm going to hit this delete button, and we can see that an action an action sheet shows up to kind of act as a confirmation dialogue to confirm that we actually want to delete this expense. And that's it for the demos today. Now we're going to take a look at some related projects. So some of these projects are going to be made by Drifty and the community themselves. So the first one is just Ionicons. This is the icon font library that Ionic provides with all of its CSS. And you can see just by scrolling down the page that there are quite a few. You can see things like labels, sunglasses, charts, and the whole way down to just JavaScript, Angular, and a whole bunch of different other icons. And if we wanted to, we could search for different icons as well. So if we don't quite know what we're looking for, but we have a general idea, we can type in, for instance, arrow, and see all the arrow icons that they provide. And just clicking on these, it'll give you the actual CSS class that you need to apply to your HTML to actually make this look as you need it to. The next thing we'll be looking at is called NG Cordova. These are basically AngularJS service wrappers for Apache Cordova plugins. This is not for just Ionic. This is for anybody using Cordova and Angular together. And this kind of provides the Angular way of doing things. This is very much a community-driven site and project, but it was created by the Ionic team. So if we go to the docs, we can see all the plugins available to you. And there's actually, I think, about 50-some available today. But each one of these, for instance, if we take a look at SQLite, for instance, it'll give you a list of all the platforms that are supported, links to the source and the official docs. It'll also show you how to get it and some examples of how to use it. And there's some other features that you'll see throughout here as well, like actually exposing all the methods that you'll have available to you. And the last that we'll be showing is called the Ionic Creator. And this is still in beta, but it still works all right. And this is basically a WYSIWYG designer for Ionic applications. So it lets you actually drag and drop different UI elements to the screen. We can click on one, and for instance, just change the text of this button. Pretty easy, and we can actually delete a button as well. And whenever it comes time to actually needing this to use it in our local application, we can export it as a zip throughout the CLI, or we can just take a look at the raw HTML as well. This is going to be especially useful for prototyping, especially for non-developers. But over the next year, I'd expect to see quite a bit out of this, just based on everything else I've seen from the Ionic team so far. And these are just a few of the side projects that are available. There's some others to keep an eye on, like Ionic IO, which is going to be kind of a service project provided by Drifty. And then you're also going to see something like Ionic Tailor, which is kind of like a theme roller, for example, specifically for Ionic. And I expect to see many more as the months roll on. All right, and to wrap up today, I'd just like to encourage you to check out the Ionic website and the Ionic project itself. If you'd just like to browse the source code, it's all available on GitHub. If you have any issues, Ionic team has a really active community available online, and there's a ton of resources for Ionic and Cordova as well. I'd also like to encourage you to check out Wijmo 5 and our new product line for Xamarin Forms, Zuni. All right, so to wrap things up, we're going to have a live Q&A session after the webcast. But I want to thank you all for joining, and if you have any questions, stay tuned.